Hi, Michael. Thank you so much for being willing to participate in our Deaf Awareness Week. This week, we're going to be centering deaf plus intersectionalities. For example, deaf people who are also children of immigrants, deaf people who are also LGBTQIA plus. So again, deaf plus another identity. I'm going to start off by asking you a few questions. And the first one is if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself. Go ahead and introduce yourself.
Oh, go ahead. Okay, I'm sorry. I was waiting for you.
Oh, no, that's fine.
Well, to start off with, my parents are originally from the country of Ghana, and my experience growing up, deaf. Well, I have both American and African identities that reside inside of me. My parents first got here, they had no clue how to help me because they were both, immigrants from Africa, and so seeking out information didn't feel as comfortable for them. One of the reasons at the time was because my mom's visa had been expired, and so seeking out information might possibly cause, some people to ask about her story. And that's probably one of the reasons why I wasn't able to get ASL at the time as a language.
So, how old were you? Well, how old were you when your parents moved here to the U.S.? Were you born and raised here in the U.S.?
Well, my parents moved here to the U.S., New York specifically, in 1973. And then I was born in 1978. So I was the first American child. Well, first generation African American in my family. The experiences that I had, I wasn't aware of the services offered to deaf and disabled people. And my parents just basically did the best they could with me, knowing that I was more considered hard of hearing at the time. The doctors recommended that I get hearing aids, which I did.
Okay.
And, the school that I was attending also encouraged that I get speech therapy. And those were the only two resources I really had at the time. This was before I knew ASL. I can't really blame my parents, though, because they were from another country and they weren't really aware of the services that were provided in this country for deaf with disabilities. I just wish my parents at the time would have possibly met some other families or joined a support group that might have been able to encourage them to seek out more for me. And so I could have found more resources available to help me become more successful. I feel like if I had that access back then, I mean, I think it was good enough for what I had, and I'm pretty successful, but that would have probably increased my success. Knowing the language of ASL and having my parents know the language of ASL, that's one of the things that I think would have really helped. The doctors and the teachers, all their advice was pretty wrong.
So, just wondering, do you think that perhaps because your parents are black and immigrants, that maybe some doctors and some teachers would have thought, well, he'll be fine. He'll be
Oh
fine
yeah,
with
I agree with
speech
that.
therapy. He'll be fine with a hearing aid. That's enough. You don't need any more resources. Do you feel like that could be part of it?
Oh, absolutely. I grew up in a predominantly Latin black neighborhood, and the people that lived in this neighborhood, they were all kind of going through the same things. Just from my own experience, I know the doctors and teachers and all the professionals were pretty much white. I feel like there was less access in my community. It was kind of just, this is what we're presented, this is what you got, and that's it. I remember meeting some white deaf friends, and the access that they had was so much more than ours. There's so much more provided to them, like better schools, so many other things. So it was a completely different experience. So it definitely had an impact because I'm black and I'm deaf. Not to mention that my family's from Africa. My parents spoke English, but it was their second language too. So there was quite a few things that complicated that.
It's language barriers, right?
Yeah. And again, remember at that time, my mother didn't have a green card or a visa. And then when she finally did get a visa, I remember I was already over the age of 11. We were waiting for it to arrive, and it was a whole new process. That process, it seemed to take forever, which was unfortunate. So overall, that did influence the way my life played out, but I know my mom did the best she could.
Right.
And for that reason, my mom's pretty cool. So she did the best she could. And, you're right, yeah. The experience that I had as a child of immigrants helped me develop a certain mindset. As a disabled deaf person. And I learned ASL later on in life, being able to get an identity that I didn't know I had. Which was, a black deaf person. So it was kind of confusing at the time. But I'm happy to this day to say that,
it was kind of like a culture
I'm
shock.
a proud deaf African man, first generation.
So in that moment, when you finally started learning sign language, it was as if it was a culture shock for you, right? You were finding a different identity than you had previously identified with. And I know you had been deaf, but you were raised orally, so you spoke and lip read. And now you were learning sign language. So you're forming a whole new identity.
Yeah, I was. When I started picking up ASL, I was learning all the basics of the language, but then I realized that it was more black ASL that I was learning. Culturally, black deaf people compared to a white deaf community, it's completely different. Black ASL is very cultural based.
Yes, heavily cultural.
And most of the time from our upbringings, we have families that are basically hearing. And they have a hearing culture way of things that's included with the black deaf culture. Some grow up going to residential schools and they apply that to their identity as well. And so it's kind of a mixture of everything in one identity. I never realized before when ASL that was a language, but I thought it was always straightforward. But there's a Spanish stylized way of having ASL as well. And each community has their own version of sign language. And that's why I became woke. Because, we as deaf people, we have language that's in different parts of the community. You have the deaf community, you have the interpreting community. And it really helps us to express ourselves. And the deaf community is actually taking notice of the fact that black ASL is an actual language. That's a part of the community. And that's how we culturally identify ourselves. And it really causes us to have a knowledge of authentic identity. So I have 3 identities: black, African, and deaf. And having those identities really helped to make up who I am. I have the American hearing friends, and I have deaf friends that are from America. Then I have the African friends. And all these cultures are completely different. They're not the same. So I can get the best of each of these cultures and identify as that.
So, yeah, both cultures kind of meld into one. Your African culture and family and your American Black deaf culture melds into one identity. That's so cool.
Yeah.
And you've become a professional in your life now. So, how, as a professional, how do you advocate for yourself, especially in the hearing world around you? How do you navigate different situations? What do you do if somebody said, well, I've never experienced working with an interpreter before. I don't know how it works. I don't know how to request an interpreter. How do you navigate those types of situations?
That's a good question. Well, first, let me just go ahead and say that I went to Cal State Northridge as a student, and it was there that I actually started understanding about the services that were offered for my classes, whether it's interpreting services or real time captioning, or even just being able to register for classes. During that time, I started learning about the ADA as well, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and it stated that I have the right legally to be able to request these services. So having that knowledge really helped me understand that I have the rights to be able to receive these services professionally. By law, I have the rights to be able to get reasonable accommodations. So initially, how I approach things is in a nice way. The first time, I like to work with people. And in order for me to be able to do the job the best I possibly can, like for a training or a meeting, I need an interpreter present. I don't need an interpreter every minute of the day, but in order for me to understand the work or how it functions to my best capability, I need certain things. One advantage that I do have from growing up oral is that I can speak. And I try not to use that if I really don't need to. The primary reason being that if I do speak, some people might have the assumption that I could hear something too. And sometimes jobs won't provide access or resources available if they think that. I want employers to be able to learn how to work with employees. So I had to kind of be sly and decide when I do things. Because companies, they need to be able to work with hard of hearing and deaf people and learn how to go about it. If companies continue to just be clueless about how to work with deaf people, there might be a possibility of a lawsuit happening, which you kind of want to avoid. They need to be able to learn how to make it accessible. And I want to be able to help the next person that comes through. See, I want to say that deaf people are capable of being able to do the job in that environment as long as accommodations are made. Saying that, I want you to know that deaf people aren't the barrier, it's the environment that is. So it needs to be figured out so that access can be available. And I want it to be a lot smoother for the next person. People with no knowledge of working with deaf people, they just have no clue. They can't visualize it. And that's basically it. I want to be able to advocate for deaf rights and not be scared to approach it or shy to approach it or talk about it. Because there's no job that's too small or basic in skill that a deaf person can't do. The only thing they can't do is hear. There's so many people that go through life that, oh, I can't do this because I can't hear, I can't do that. But the real problem is the environmental barrier. It's not the actual deaf person. As long as there's an accommodation made for that person, there's no job that they can't do.
Right. Yes. Yes, I completely agree.
100%.
So I do have one last thing. What's something that you, Michael, would like to tell hearing people in general, those who don't know sign language, what's a message that you would like to give as a deaf person to hearing people at large? Something that you want them to know.
Well, just to be able to keep an open mind about people that are different from yourself. Be patient, especially right now in the times of coronavirus, where most people have a mask that cover their mouth. It's a barrier for deaf people, that don't have hearing. In this day and age, learning ASL is one of the best things you can do. Even just learning the basics is the best. Because even though that face mask is on there, some of the grammar and knowledge is lost, but ASL makes up for that. And ASL itself is becoming more mainstreamed, and people are beginning to recognize it more as a language. And you see it, for music and concerts. You see ASL becoming more prevalent.
Right.
And that kind of exposure to people, that might not have an awareness of that, I just ask that they have more open minds about it, be more accepting of it. Be more welcoming, be more patient. Just be nice, Be a decent human being. That's it. It's that simple.
Right. Also, learn sign language.
Yeah, exactly. Basically.
I know you teach sign language, right?
Yeah.
Where?
Well, I teach. I teach for that sole purpose. Because if I'm able to get the word out, more people will come. And I'm not charging anything. I want people to be able to get access and learn about this language. My goal is access. And I'm tired, I'm tired of having to fight and complain about access not being available.
Right, and yeah, you're right.
And that's one of the reasons why I love you guys at Pro Bono ASL. Because you make access possible.
We love you too.
And that makes my heart happy. Really, since last year, I've had more access to be able to go to the things that I care about. Like protests, and just really all the little things,
Right.
I really can't even believe it. I can get to be involved fully without having to complain or, oh, I can't afford an interpreter, or I don't know about getting an interpreter. I feel like this year, we've been through a lot of pain and sorrow. But through that pain and sorrow, we found some successes. And evidently,
it's kind of
help. And several resources. And bringing our voice to the table. And I look forward to better and bigger things from all of you guys. And from the deaf community. And we're working together to make it better.
We want accessibility to become the norm.
Yep.
Deaf people should not have to fight so hard in order to get an interpreter.
Mm-hmm.
That, and also we want to make sure that we're providing interpreters who are, how do I phrase this? Interpreters who are culturally competent.
Yep.
For any situation.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. There's definitely a cultural aspect to that. Having had exposure to that particular... okay, I'm not trying to offend any of my white interpreters or anything like that, but you're right. Sometimes I want someone with cultural understanding. Somebody that's been around that kind of a deaf experience. Someone who can voice that experience from their own personal experience. I'm definitely not going to turn down a professional interpreter. If they're available, that's awesome. I'll take what I can get. But if I have the option between, a Latin interpreter or a black interpreter, okay, of course I'm going to take that, Come hook it up with me, that's awesome.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. You don't see it very often, so it's nice when it actually does happen. It's really nice. I want an interpreter that's going to be able to have a strong male voice when I want one, or an angry male voice when I want one. Someone that's a black interpreter that can express what I want. Someone from Compton voicing for me. That's what I want.
Yeah, they definitely should match. Okay, Michael, thank you so, so, so much for your time today. I really do appreciate it. I love our conversations always.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
Yes, thank you. Take care. Have a good day.